Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week we're going to do a watercolour study of an animal in a landscape. So I'm starting off with some A4 mixed media paper, and what you just saw was me wetting the surface of the paper with a clean brush, and now I'm introducing just a light wash to fill in the sky. So this is a mix of ultramarine blue and raw umber, because the scene we're depicting today is a landscape of Dartmoor, which is a big national park in Devon. A lot of high ground, a lot of heather, a lot of gorse, a lot of rocky outcrops on the tops of the hills. And I'm just using some paper towel to lift off some of the areas of the wet paint here, and that's going to suggest the presence of just some light clouds. And now with a big round brush, I'm popping in the distant hills. So I've added a little bit of yellow to the mix I already had, but not too much. Still keeping the distant hills nice and blue, and a little bit browny as well. And once again, just a light wash to suggest the presence of those hills and help create a sense of distance. So as we come more and more into the foreground, we're going to gradually make the paint thicker, make the colours more intense. Now you can see I'm adding more of a yellow ochre green, yellow ochre hinted green if you like. And this particular round brush has got a little bit of a frayed tip, and so I'm using that to my advantage, both in the distant background and also in this nearer foreground when creating the landscape. So if I get some little frayed brush strokes because of that, those little wayward strands, wayward bristles on the end of the brush, then that's absolutely fine. And of course, when working in watercolour, the paint is typically so fluid that you can get very characterful marks by rolling the brush or tapping the brush, or just varying the pressure you have between the brush and the paper. So having kept most of the marks more or less horizontal up until now, for the foreground grass and foliage, you can see the brush is now near vertical, and I'm just lightly tapping in that area, that foreground area. And notice also that these greens are gradually getting warmer and warmer in hue as we come towards the foreground. So the distant hills are very bluey, the midground is kind of greeny brownish, and this is much more of a yellowy green. And I'm also just varying the marks I'm making here as well, switching now to a brighter version of my yellowy green and putting that down a little bit heavier now, a little bit heavier. So we wetted the surface of the paper for the upper third of the composition, because that allows you to put down a nice clean wash. It's kind of working wet in wet if you like. But for the rest of the time the paper was dry, and that allows more control of where you put the different marks. So I'm coming in now just tapping the very ends of the brush to introduce a little bank of gorse here. Gorse is characterised by its vibrant yellow flower, but I'm being careful not to make the yellow too bright and too pure, because these plants are still off in the distance. So we can adjust the intensities of our yellows by taking them slightly towards the brown, and we can do that by adding perhaps a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, or maybe just add a little bit of brown, a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of raw umber. And it's watercolour is great for very quick experiments. Just play around with the different colours that you can mix up, both on the page and also on the palette. So you can see quite quickly that we've established a sense of space and a sense of the landscape, and now I can begin to add some shadow areas. And I didn't mention it at the start because it wasn't all that clear to see on the blank paper, but you can also see that I've penciled in right at the beginning. I penciled in the rough outline of the cow, and also I had penciled in the horizon line and a couple of other key contours of the landscape, but very, very little detail. So while I was chatting away there, with the same technique I used for the gorse flowers, I added in a bit of a purpley blue on the left-hand side of the painting there, in the midground, just to begin to suggest some shadows within those plants. And I'm using that same colour but with different brush strokes to fill in most of the silhouette of the cow. So these cows are nearly all black with this single white stripe around their belly, or around their midriff, I guess I should say. And so I've deliberately left the top of the middle section of the cow's body as just the paper showing through. So deliberately not going to paint over that. And I'm going to go deeper and deeper into the tones of this cow. But for now, I'm really just blocking in, making sure we fill in the cow with a certain amount of colour. So I'm taking some care of the direction of my brush strokes here, but I'm not worried too much for the most part, because, as I said, I'm mostly going to go over most of that paint, maybe with 2 or 3 different layers. But that said, on the midriff, I did use some curved brush strokes, and I deliberately left the top of the midriff section as a jagged edge as well. And now I'm taking that same colour, because it's kind of a purplish blue, and so that's going to help to suggest some distant patches of heather off in the foreground there. What I'm doing right now is just tapping in a little bit of tone right on the top of that hill. Dartmoor is characterised by these huge rocky outcrops known as tors, and that's just the beginning of an indication of one on the top of that very distant hill there. So coming back to our plant life, nearer the foreground, just layering on different textures and slightly different colours. So the idea here is going to be to suggest the landscape very lightly and very loosely, and then make the animal itself much higher contrast, much stronger tones, to help create a sense of space. So one of the great things about going to Dartmoor is it doesn't matter what time of year you go, whether it's in the middle of tourist season or the depths of winter, the area is so huge that you never feel crowded. You can always have some space to yourself if that's what you're after. And in keeping with that, many of the animals have a huge amount of room to wander and explore, much more so than is typical for farmland in England. And so I'm only going to paint one cow in this particular painting, but what you'll often find is when you're up there looking around, you sort of say, oh, there's a cow there, and then, oh, are they on their own? And then you'll spot another one and another one and another one, and you suddenly realise there are about 30 cows. It's just they're so spaced out and kind of hidden in behind all the different rocks and long grass and all the different plants that you don't notice them straight away. And the same is true for the sheep and the Dartmoor ponies as well. So it's a really amazing environment to explore, both for the animal life and for the plants and for the scenery and the views from the top of the hills. I mean, the entire area is just incredibly beautiful. And you can see now, while I was talking there, beginning to add some deeper blue tones to this cow. And I am taking more care now with the directions of my brush strokes. So in the same way I use the frayed edge or the frayed tip of the brush, you can see I use that on the hind quarters there to suggest the presence of some hair falling from upper left to lower right. And, really just gradually strengthening these tones. So continuing to add the blue to the cow. And you can see already that stronger colour is starting to bring the animal forward compared to the distant hills. Now obviously if you look across the top of the animal's back, I've got some blank paper there. So I need to fill that area in. And having just put a bit of a shadowy green colour under the cow, I'm now using that same colour across the top of the animal. And we'll go back over that in a moment to both add a bit of texture and colour, but also, I don't really want just a single stripe of green across the top of the back there. So we definitely need to change the outline of that so it's not quite so linear, and that's what I'm doing a little bit of there, just kind of roughening the edges, making it look a little bit more like the randomness of plant growth. And while I've got that colour on my brush, you can see I'm using lots of different styles of marks to just introduce a little touch of shadowy green underneath some of the flowers that we have up on the moor. As I said before, lots of heather, so that's the purple flower, obviously some blue heather as well you can get, and then the gorse with the bright yellow flowers. And then just some rather larger, looser marks added to the foreground. So although we're conscious of controlling the strength of colours and the temperature of the colours, background relative to foreground, we can still use them across fairly large parts of the painting to keep a little bit of coherence in the colour scheme. But what I'm doing just now is adding in kind of a reddish brown, both over the top of some of the blue on this belted Galloway cow, and also on areas which have so far been uncoated, because although the hair is black, they do have a little bit of reddish brown in them quite often, and that tends to show up especially in the bright sunshine. So just introducing a touch of that here and there. And of course, if I layer that over the top of the blue undercoat, then that tends to take it a little bit more towards black anyway. So it's nice to have a little bit of dimension in the colours you put into animals, rather than just make them a single colour. It's the same if you paint the flesh on a human. It's all very well. You can start off with perhaps a pinkish base, or whatever colour, maybe a yellow ochre base, whatever you feel you need to start with. But then the light will be bouncing off of that base colour, adding extra hues, and the shadow colours will have colour within them. So it's always going to be a multitude of colours, really. But I'm coming in now with some darker purple and just touching the ends of the brush over that strip of green that I put down, just helping to break that up a little bit, and again keeping that darker colour going across the width of the painting. So you can see what we've got is in the very distance, we've got just very light washes, no detail. And then for the midground, we've got some detail, but not really much drawing going on. And then for the animal itself, we've got a bit of both. And also there's a contrast between the style of painting on the animal and the grassland surrounding him, or her in this case. But I'm coming back in now with a deeper blue than I used before. And I think this is actually ultramarine blue, if I remember correctly, mixed with some burnt umber. So it's not a black, but it's a very dark blue that gives. And you can see as I gradually darken the black areas of the animal, then the top of the animal's back, where that white stripe is, that really starts to come to life. It feels more and more like there's light striking the top of the animal's back. But in addition, the shadowy area on the white stripe, that's starting to look more accurate now, because the paleness of that shadow contrasts quite well with the dark shadow areas on the rest of the animal. One of the things I really like doing if I'm working in watercolour is I'll just add a little bit of, a few pen lines here and there with a biro to add little touches of detail. It adds again another little texture to the work. So we'll do that in just a little bit. But when I do that sort of thing, I do take care to ensure that the paint is fully dry. So you can see we're getting quite a reflection in the camera of the wet paint on the we've just a little time jump there for exactly that reason. So I let the paint completely dry, and now I'm coming in with my biro and just kind of adding these little sort of delicious little squiggly lines to add a bit more texture and suggest the tangles of hair that are on these types of cows. And I'm carrying those little textural marks, those little bursts of line, from the area of where the light is catching on the white stripe all the way through to the shadow area, and that helps kind of soften the boundary between that kind of purpley bluey grey of the shadow and the pure white along the top of the cow. And I'm also just going around the rest of the belted Galloway and refining some of the drawing that I've done, because as you know, I just started off with some very simple pencil lines, and they've been slightly modified by the paint, and they weren't all that precise to begin with. They were just it was just a very simplified shape. So I'm both making little corrections to the outline of the animal, and also adding a few frayed edges and little bits of texture here and there as well. So we can just, we don't want too many, but just here and there, just these little touches help to make it a bit more convincing that we're looking at something that's hairy. But when we do this, what we want to do is be careful not to repeat the same style of mark over and over again. So you definitely want to vary the type of mark you're making, so that there's a random element to it. Otherwise, it looks rather too regular and very much manufactured, which obviously is not what we're aiming for. So having done that, I'm now coming in with a watercolour marker pen. So to be honest, I could have done this just as easily with the brush, but I had one of these watercolour marker pens to hand, so it's still watercolour we're putting down, and just the ease of using the nib to fill in some of these outlines and just darken certain areas. So this is a Prussian blue that I'm using here, and it just makes life easy, really. And of course, I can still move that paint around a little bit with a wet brush if I want to. So it's not it's not a big deal basically switching between the brush and the pen. So my original intention was to leave the top of the back there just completely without line, but I decided to add a little bit of biro. Now, but notice I haven't made it a continuous line across the back. There is a gap in it, but I just felt it needed a little extra pop, a little extra outline to just define the line of that back better. Also, the biro I was using was blue. I didn't use pure black because I think it would sort of deaden the image too much. Now I'm coming in now though with a mixture of burnt umber and just a little touch of blue. So getting closer to a black now, but still not pure black that we're adding in here. And again, just gradually deepening the shadows where required to create that sense of 3 dimensions. And again, the more we enhance the contrast of the animal compared to the very low contrast background, the greater the sense of depth we're going to create in our landscape. And equally, the textures of the grass, which have the grass and the plants, which have been very, very, very loosely conveyed, they become a little bit more acceptable to the eye if you've got a rather better drawn animal to sit next to them in contrast. You notice I've switched to a fairly small brush now, but it's still a round brush. I do use flat brushes definitely for watercolour, but depending on what I'm doing, for this style of painting, the round brushes seem to work better because they tend to hang on to the watercolour paint rather better, I think. And as I showed you earlier, when I was painting the landscape, you can get a great range of marks with those. So just enhancing the brown areas. The brown I had before, certainly once I'd made the black of the animals that much darker, it was looking a little bit too pale and pinky. So I've gone for a deeper, more reddish brown now, which is much more in keeping with the colour of the belted Galloway cows. Now, switch to sort of a brighter blue to add a couple of little highlights on the back end of the animal where the light is catching it. And you'll often find that with animals that we normally consider to have black fur or hair. In the sunlight, the highlights on the fur or the hair will be a deep blue, and I quite enjoy enhancing those highlights. So I'm using a brighter blue than is strictly speaking necessary, and I felt the need to kind of just strengthen some of the colour underneath the cow. So I'm coming in with a yellowy green, and I'm putting that on a little bit more thickly. I mean, it's still quite a fluid mix of paint, but a little bit more thickly than I did for the first layer. And really, at this stage, we're just making small adjustments here and there to gradually pull the key focus of the picture, which is obviously the animal, pull it all together. So I'm coming in with a dark brown now, still fairly transparent, adding a little bit of detail to the cast shadow underneath the cow, and also strengthening that shadow as well. But again, we've got various colours and marks within that shadow. We've got a sort of a darker green than the surrounding grass. We've got some dark brown. I'm now putting on the same brown in a little bit more of a transparent way. And while I've got that on the brush, I'll just add a few quick lines, a few squiggly lines of some twigs sticking up through the grass. So on Dartmoor, it's very much a rugged landscape. So you tend to find sort of coarser grasses and little plants that you don't normally find on the lower land in Devon. Now that little mark I put in on the horizon line there to represent the tor, this rocky outcrop, it wasn't quite a solid mass, so I'm just using a pencil and a little bit of finger smudging to fill that in, because I definitely don't want to risk making that any brighter or darker, because I need that to stay way back in the distance. Back in with my biro now, Still the blue biro, and I just want to make a little bit more jagged some of the edges of that white stripe, and I'm just putting in a little bit more detail to the udder there, just making the description of it a little bit clearer. And again, we don't want to overdo it, but it's just a case of adding a little touch here and there, because I certainly don't want this to become a biro drawing. I wanted it to be a watercolour study, but for me, I really like the way the biro, the little bit of line work, works against those pale washes. And that's something I do from time to time, is just a pale wash of paint, whether it's acrylic or watercolour, and then work in, or sometimes even just with smudged pencil actually, and then I work over the top of that with biro for the line work. And I really love the contrast in textures and colour and style of mark that you can make. It makes for some quite unique looking colour schemes actually. So definitely something worth exploring if you haven't given it a go. Really good fun. So a couple of touches of biro onto the grass as well. Again, not going to go too crazy with that, but just including a couple of little touches. Back in with the small brush, just adjusting the line of the neck. I had inadvertently just created a little bit of an unnecessary recess at the base of the neck there, where it joins the head, and that was throwing things off a little bit. And just adding a bit more part of obviously the nose of the cow is hidden in amongst that grass, but I felt I just needed to add a little bit more to make it a bit more convincing. And then what I'm doing here is I put a few dots of paint off in the distance, and they were a little bit jarring against the white background. So I'm just putting a light wash of a pale purple to suggest a patch of heather off in the distance there and kind of soften those marks. So we're getting fairly close to completion now. A few darker shadows on the heather in the mid-ground. Now obviously the plant life just behind the cow, it's perhaps not that well realised, and it's really quite abstract. But for the purposes of this fairly quick study, I'm quite happy with that. Here's the finished painting. So you can see we've created quite a nice sense of depth with the very pale washes and the complete lack of detail in the pale sky. Then we've got some abstraction for the heather and gorse in the midground, and for the foreground grasses, which are kind of depicted in a much larger mark-making style. And then the cow has a wider range of colours and line work and texture, and is also much more carefully drawn. So anyway, there we go. That's this little painting, little study in watercolour of a belted Galloway cow on Dartmoor, all finished. Hope you enjoyed the video. As usual, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next Sunday for the next episode of The Sunday Art Show. Thanks again for watching.